I awoke and stumbled to my feet, my head reeling. The stones crunched under my feet. I was dusty from lying on the ground, the dry taste of limestone in my mouth clogging up my pores. The air was fresh and sweet. I couldn't remember the last time I had tasted the countryside. I also had no recollection how I had come to be here. It certainly wasn't where I had intended to be at this time, and being here presented many problems. Predominantly, the question of how to get back occupied my mind. But seeing no use in musing upon this in my current location, I set off down the path. The birds were close, and my intrusion in their habitat didn't seem to bother them. I began to wonder if they might be talking about me as I passed. Not that I minded this. In fact, I appreciated the attention. It was just as I was becoming accustomed to the company of the forest, with my soundtrack of birdsong, when I saw a distant figure down the path. They turned a bend in the track, and I ran to catch up with them. But when I got round the bend, they were nowhere to be seen. This brief sighting of another human being rather upset my mood. My unrequited contact with them made me pang for all humanity. I carried on down the path. I hadn't been walking long when I noticed signs of human activity. Some kind of primitive encampment down in the valley. Eager to meet whoever may be occupying this loose collection of buildings, I raced down the driveway, expecting some sort of warm welcome when I got to the settlement. I found it deserted. No matter. I resolved myself to wait, anticipating the prompt return of its native inhabitants. As I waited, eager to meet the people of this place, to feast and drink with them, I explored their camp. Their writing was crude, simple, yet expressive. The black marks denoted relationships and simple gestures of base affection. At one end of the settlement sat a large metal cauldron, squat in the ground, and surrounded by charred remains. I attempted to lift the lid, in the hope of discovering what it was they had been burning. But all my strength could not shift the large metal dish. The natives must be vastly superior to me in strength and stature. It was then that I heard the voices in the woods. Suddenly I was no longer keen to be here when the occupants of this settlement arrived. Turning to make my way out of the village, I hurriedly retraced my steps past the area with the vulgar hieroglyphs, which seemed to take on a much more sinister reading. The voices were drawing ever closer, and I sprinted up the track, back to the top of the village, stumbling in panic as I went. I feared that I had left some offensive evidence of my presence in the village, and that the savages would chase me. But as I left the horror behind me, I heard the voices fading in the distance, hearing no tones of anger. I stopped running as the woods began to thin, feeling more at ease where I could see the sky, away from the immediate closeness of the forest. I headed along a path that bordered a field for a time, and slowly my thudding heart subsided in my chest. I walked this path for some time. Eventually it turned back into the valley, back into the woods. I composed myself to re-enter the forest. I thought there might be a chance that the path would lead back out of the woods and up to the high ground on the other side of the valley, which just might offer me a vantage point from which to assess my location, predicament, and I hoped give my wanderings in this strange land some focus. I noticed some fading hybrid bluebells. They usually bloom in May. Nothing else notable happened on my foray back into the forest. No signs of humanity. Just the birdsong. The gate let me out onto a field of grass which sloped gently up the hillside. They look like they are contemplating something deep. Perhaps they are trapped, stuck in a conversation with themselves. Grass was hazy, the air soft and thick on the slope. After a heavy climb, I reached the crest of the hill, and in the distance, a tall glade of trees, from which issued such an intense sound of thronging humanity. I paused for some time, contemplating the efficacy of approaching what sounded like a huge gathering of people. The glade was alluring. I looked around the field. I see in one corner a fenced-off copse of young trees. Whilst I deliberated upon my readiness to return to humanity, I thought I might just take a look around this enclosure. I was most curious why one might put a fence around such trees. It was hardly an obstacle to them. I approached, and as I entered the copse, it became apparent that the trees only formed a perimeter, within which was another wall of tall grass, and at the centre of this enclosure I found a scene which I find difficult to retell, even now. But I will do the best I can. Please, bear with me. I both saw and heard the ancient stone first, poking out of the ground like a splinter. There was a distant rumble, which seemed to be emanating from it. And as I stepped into the ring, I heard it speak. He simply mustn't venture there. He's risking too much already.
Of course he has to go there. He must find out who's in those trees and be reunited with his people,
spoke the upstart mole. He was lying on a bench. Both of you are right, to a certain degree. He should see his people, but caution is necessary, mused a toadstool, standing between the two other members of this chorus of apparent advice for me. You've rambled the world and seen nothing. We thought it would make you a well-rounded individual, but instead you will never know what it means to be human. They all piped up together. I had to say, I was bemused. I asked them to continue, but they informed me that they had said too much already, and at that they fell silent. After a time, I stumbled, dazed from that ring of trees. Their song had struck me in a way I would only later come to understand. And now I knew I must join humanity. I like foxgloves. As I entered the realm of men, there were fences everywhere, strange guardians and watchtowers. I moved among them in my disguise. On the outskirts of the place I would later come to know as the garden. They kept the most complex life forms, the horse, and sheep, and chickens for their study and amusement. And most impressive specimens they were too. My shared fascination in these creatures was my first initiation in the group, and my stroll through the Italianate garden was their initiation to me. With its suggestive symmetry and order, I was becalmed by its rigidity, and views of the hills were framed beautifully in the seductive smile of a hedge. I thought I might find it agreeable to live in this enclosure, tastefully adorned as it was. My guides informed me that I should report to the kitchen garden in order to see the heart of what goes on here. What I found there still haunts me to this day. Inside those brick walls were rows upon rows of segregated plants, all being manipulated to conform to their canes, their guards, walkie-talkies buzzing, brandished secateurs to prune back any mischievous plant that got above its station. I later came to understand that the gardener's role and actions were based on fear. They feared the plants, and so worked tirelessly to regiment them, ordered and controlled them through segregation, caning and clipping to reduce the likelihood of rebellion. Also feeding the plants with fertilizer, catering to their nutritional needs, that they might become lethargic and forgetful. I once tried talking to some of the plants. When I asked them how long they had been there, they seemed to have no knowledge. I asked a sweet pea if they had ever known its parents or family. She told me she was of the legume family. What did she need family for anyway? I stopped seeing her after that. I never told her what I had seen them do to the plants the year before. I thought I could save her, but she didn't want to be saved. It all got too much when I saw what the gardeners called harvest, stripping each plant of its limbs or babies while still in their embryonic state. Once this is done, what is left of the plant is thrown onto a mass grave, the decomposed matter of which is fed to the plants in subsequent years. I found memorials to gardeners of previous generations, the pioneers of this community, relics from those early years left to remind the current stock of workers what they were fighting for, as though demonstrating their provenance legitimize their actions. I found my way to the head gardener's office one day. I waited while they were using frozen seeds they kept in storage to plan next season's planting schedule, cross-referencing against last year's crop rotation as they went. Eventually, they seemed to come to a hiatus in their work, sat back in their chair, and acknowledged me. "So, how are you fitting in here?" they asked. I didn't answer. "I understand you have expressed concerns about what we are doing." I struggled for words, but the head gardener gently interrupted. "It's all right. You're not on trial," though I had the distinct impression that I was. Not everyone who finds us stays indefinitely, though it is very rare for someone to choose to leave. We are trying to build a harmonious society here, where nature and humanity can exist in harmony, mutually beneficial to each other's needs. I had heard the gardeners towing this line before. I presumed it was the head gardener's own philosophy, and I said as much. They asked me to take a seat, and with a wearisome half-smile, as one would give a child whose disobedience one still finds patiently amusing, they began. "You were wandering for some time in the chaos of nature, weren't you? Unable to process what you saw, unable to focus, just getting by. I nodded slowly. Here, I give people purpose, a structure within which they feel able to express themselves, and we can work together to create. The people living here get the certainty of existence which they crave. You felt the fear of nature, didn't you? You are as guilty as us for hating the trees which blocked your vision. This garden is a place without fear. Instead of natural obstacles created to trap you, I create walls to keep you safe. What the head gardener said made sense. There was a pleasing logic that made me feel at ease. And sensing this change in my mood, the gardener's patronizing smile spread to the rest of their face. I left the small office, following a path through the outskirts of the garden. I daren't look behind me for fear of raising suspicion. I meandered, giving the impression of an aimless wanderer. I was good at that. When I reached the west lawn, I paused briefly. Then I headed for the trees.